Good evening, Cambridge viewers, and welcome to Women Speak, the monthly live women's show here on Cambridge Cable TV. My name is Tess Ewing, and I'm your host, as usual, on this show, but the rest of the show is not exactly usual. Usually we broadcast on the first Wednesday of the month, and we talk about issues of women in work. But today, we're doing something a little bit different in honor of the wrapping up the grand opening of finishing of a wonderful project, and we're going to do a little bit about an important incident in Cambridge women's history. So 46 years ago, in March, women who were marching for International Women's Day took over a Harvard building on Memorial Drive. And they held that building, or I should say we held that building for, 9 or 10 days, one of you historians tell me, something like that, and didn't leave until we had some assurances that some of our demands had been met, that Harvard was going to promise to build low-income housing on the site, and we got a promise of seed money from an angel connected to Harvard to put a down payment on a building which became the Cambridge Women's Center that still exists today on Pleasant Street. So that's the background, and out of that came a collective, a group of women who formed the 888 Women's History Project. And I should mention that 888 was the address of Memorial Drive where the building existed. And they said, well, we're not going to let this piece of history be forgotten. And so they went to work on that, and then they brought in a filmmaker who made a film called Left on Pearl, which has gone through a number of iterations and reiterations, and is finally about to have its grand opening the day after tomorrow. So, welcome, Rochelle, Ruthchild, Libby Bouvier, sorry, Lily works here. Two of the members of the 888 Women's History Project. Rochelle's a historian, Libby's an archivist, and Susie Rivo is the filmmaker, the executive producer and director, and I don't know what all else. And they're the executive. Oh, jeez. Sorry, everybody. Executive producer.
Yeah,
and
director.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome.
Thank you.
We're delighted to be here.
I'm so psyched that this film is finally coming out. So, hey, tell us a little bit about how it came about.
Well, it actually was in around the year 2000, the turn of the 21st century, when Susan Jacoby, who's another member of our collective, said to me, Rochelle, we better document the history of this takeover before we all forget everything. So we started to work in the year 2000 and started interviewing in the old and current, I suppose, women's movement idea that we could do everything. And we got our little cameras and we went and started interviewing people. And we soon found out that we couldn't do everything, that we needed a certain level of technological expertise and filmmaking expertise, which we couldn't have. We didn't have amongst ourselves. And so at that point, in 2003, we hired Susie Rivo to be our filmmaker. And I must admit that one of the great things about doing this film is the intergenerational connections that we've made, and also it's really, really exciting to just see how the younger generation of women is so adept at and comfortable with the kind of technology which has evolved over the years since the actual takeover.
Well, it's been a wonderful experience working with Rochelle and Libby and Susan Jacoby and meeting all the fabulous people like yourself, Tess, who we interviewed. We interviewed about probably 60 individuals at least.
Wow.
Yeah, and
That could be a long film.
yeah, it could be a long film. It made it really hard to, pare it down to a reasonable length. But we heard a lot of wonderful stories, and it was really an honor to meet all these great women.
So, did the 888 Women's History Project, have you done other things besides the film? Because I know you're an archivist, and I just know that you've probably squirreled away a whole bunch of papers and who knows what all.
Well, we do have some documentation that people have put together over the years, and I think what we really have that's exciting is the original film footage from the time period, from the March 1971 takeover, which is really very, very important that we have that. And one of the things that Susie has done is really to develop that film, because a lot of it was in pieces from when it was at the, and still is, but in a different format at the Boston Public Library. But we also have
Excuse me a second, the original film, we didn't film it.
no.
Was this news footage?
There's
or
a
what?
couple of different pieces. There were some women, 2 women, I believe, and you can see them at an early part of the film. The woman is carrying some of the equipment. At that time they were using 16 millimeter, and we found that film, 17 minutes of it, at the Schlesinger Library in Harvard Square, and also other footage from Channel 5. And since then, Susie has, I think, found more film that we are using, she is using part of in film that we'll see Friday. But also we have a lot of tapes in different formats of the interviews that were done, which was close to 60, I think, at this point. And there's other print material. We have a lot of print material from some of the early women's organizations at the time, Bread and Roses and Female Liberation. And lots of articles, of course, about the takeover from the local press.
Photos, lots of still photos.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, in order to tell the story, we had to kind of contextualize it using photos that weren't necessarily from that exact event, but from the time in general, because our interviewees are telling the story of what was going on in the broader, anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, tenants' rights, students' rebellions, all sorts of things were happening. So we wanted to
Probably wouldn't make a lot of sense to younger people today without that contextualizing.
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds so odd to take over a building,
Yeah,
but
why not just do a tweet storm?
Yeah, really, why don't you just, put it on Instagram? But it was happening a lot. There were a lot of building takeovers, and it was just a really intense period of time where there was a lot of political ferment, as you know, and so we had to somehow bring that to, make that visible in the film. So we used so many different sources from all sorts of archives, and we used a lot of footage that was repurposed, like the Prelinger Archive, which is based in San Francisco, has all these educational films that were used in schools for many decades, and they look very dated now. But you can use them to kind of illustrate what the mainstream culture's values were, and what was expected of women and the family and stuff like that. And so when people talk about like the context that they came from and the expectations that their families had for them, we can use those visuals to kind of play off of. So we use stuff like that.
So did you have to travel all over the country to get this footage?
Well, fortunately, we were able to get a lot of stock footage just,
Online?
electronically,
Yeah.
But we did interviews in other parts of the country. So I am from the Bay Area originally, so when I was out there at some point visiting family, I was able to find some of the people who were involved in the takeover.
Oh.
And that was great, and like one person led to another person, and pretty soon I had 3 or 4, I think I had 4 interviews out there. And they all, we they contributed a lot, and they're all in there, either voice or on camera. Yeah. So
It's
that
kind
was
of like,
exciting.
it's kind of like a detective story, because one person led to another person, led to another person, and the woman who gave us part of the money for the down payment of the house had disappeared. We were having trouble finding her, and then we found her in an assisted living place outside of Boston, but that took a while to track her down, and you know, a lot of the story, like she hadn't really told the story to her family in any detail, so a lot of the relatives of people who we interviewed really didn't know the story. And it's a classic, I don't know if it's classic, but it's a very Cambridge story. And when you have the president of Harvard saying, we have to know our history, and this is part of our history. It's part of the history of Cambridge, it's part of the history of Boston, it's part of the history of Harvard, but it's not a history that you find in the histories that are written about these institutions, or the histories that are written about Cambridge. And yet it's a very, as Susie has said, and Libby has said too, that it's a history where you have the interaction and connection between all kinds of different groups. For example, the building that we took over was a building that was contested by the residents of the local Riverside community who wanted that area for affordable housing. So this was a building that had a number of people really putting claims on it, including Harvard, which wanted the building for graduate housing, or wanted that land for graduate housing. So we try to complicate the history by showing all the different ways that the various struggles interacted and how that connected with what Harvard wanted to do with that land.
It was Harvard-owned land.
Yes,
The building was Harvard-owned.
That building was Harvard, yeah.
Yeah, but they had a hard time doing what they wanted with it. I mean, it took 30 years before they were able to build student housing, because there was a lot of community opposition to building yet another Harvard, site there. That was the last piece of the river, excuse me, the Charles River that was not obstructed by, they wanted
to
to
see.
Yeah,
Had
that
a
you
view
could see.
of the river.
Exactly.
Yeah, the
So-
riverfront, yeah.
the riverfront that hadn't been built on yet. So people really wanted that for low-income housing. And the reason for that was because so many people had been displaced, so many families had been displaced by Harvard's expansion into
Right.
the community over the years, starting in the 50s. So this was kind of like the last little bit of land, and that was what they wanted. And they had, the community had taken over the Harvard graduation, the commencement ceremony in 1970, the year before, which we were amazingly lucky to find the footage of.
We have footage of that.
We have
yes.
footage of it, and it's really amazing. It's hard to imagine something like that happening today. They a bunch of people from the community who'd really tried to get a meeting with Harvard and been turned down over and over. They took over the commencement ceremony and jumped up on the stage and, stopped everything for quite a while. Anyway, so eventually Harvard did build housing there, but it did take 30 years. Not housing that was, not the low-income housing.
Unfortunately, not the low-income housing that they
But
had
dorms.
said they were going to do, but
Yeah, but there were some other developments that came out indirectly, came out of this action. Besides the Women's Center itself, there were several different affordable housing developments that came about. I mean, they may have come about anyway, but all of these things kind of pushed it forward.
push it, yeah. So, okay, it's kind of interesting, you're filling me in on the history now, because I didn't really know what happened afterwards. I mean,
Yeah.
I had noticed that there wasn't low-income housing on that spot, but they had said they were gonna do it.
Well, actually, there were negotiations and meetings, and they were told, the community, the Riverside planning team, forget exactly what it's called, were told that the land was too valuable for low-income housing.
Yeah, we can't have poor people getting at Riverview.
Exactly, right.
Right. They told them that outright. And so there was another nearby, Howard Street had some
Yes, right.
some possible spot for housing, and they did build housing
They did
there.
build housing.
And then they have the park there
Yeah.
also, but yeah, it's, as I say, I mean, I think it's a Cambridge story, but it's a story that really resonates in other parts of the country as well. And now that you have women marching again, it's
Indeed, that's right. Yeah. I think those, now, there was a women's march in Boston in what, 1970 was maybe the first one? That was when the whole concept of International Women's Day was kind of revived from back in the beginning of the 20th century when it started. And so, you know, and then they sprang up around the country, and that was, people didn't do women's marches before, you know, since the suffragists, of course, did, but they hadn't for a long time. So yeah, now we're doing it again.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's why they called it the second wave, right?
Yes, right.
Because it sort of was dormant for
It was
40 years or
for all
something.
that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, now we have lots of reasons to be marching.
We do indeed. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
We've got to.
well, I mean, but we also shouldn't forget that there were things that came out of this march and the takeover that have become institutions in the community, which which have made and are making a contribution in terms of women, or the second wave, certainly the Women's Center and the various activities that are happening there, and then other community groups such as City Life, which kind of had its beginnings with conversations at the building during the takeover, as well as other organizations. So
City Life was it started as a tenant action group in Jamaica Plain, but women in City Life had been living in Cambridge before and moved to Jamaica Plain, and now they do, I think, a lot more than housing, but they've done a lot of stopping people from being evicted and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, they have a campaign going on now called Right to the City. So they're trying to pass some legislation through Boston City Council that would stop no-fault evictions, or would sort of regulate them a little bit better.
Yeah.
So that's a very important contribution.
Were there other?
Well, there were other groups that started out of the Women's Center as well, although there was also an auto mechanics class at the building, which continued in various
That's
formats
true. There were a number of
afterwards.
things that came out of that
Yeah.
don't still exist, but that's right. There were karate classes,
yes.
auto mechanics classes.
Yes.
In those days, those things were completely, really unusual for women
Yes,
to
right.
do, let alone making films. Women didn't do that either.
Well, there
But,
were a few. I have to
there were
make a
a few.
shout out. We can come back to this, but I have to make a shout out to Maureen McHugh, who's our angel, because she made the film Genesis 3:16, without which we probably would not have a film. I mean, she was very kind and allowed us to use some bits from her film to illustrate what was going on, because how else would you have any footage of what was going on in people's living rooms and
Yeah.
you know, in the women's communes and all sorts of activities that, I mean, people didn't have cell phone cameras, so very little was actually documented on
Those
film.
big heavy things.
Yes, right.
And people didn't even take pictures all that much. It's really hard to get pictures
That's right.
from that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she made a film about the early, you know, women's movement in the Cambridge area that was really great, called Genesis 3:16, based on the biblical passage that women should suffer in childbirth. And it's really good, and we were able to track it down and get a really good quality version, get it transferred, and we used a lot of footage from it. I mean, altogether it's probably about 4 minutes, but it's used very judiciously
Yeah.
and throughout the film in really important places. So that's why we have images of the karate activities
yeah.
and
Dances.
dances,
Yeah.
all that
Mhm.
stuff that
With-
was repurposed.
But she did,
Meetings.
okay, yeah.
And she's a British woman who has also been really supportive of the film, beyond just allowing us to use the footage. So thank you, Maureen.
But overall, I
Maureen, wherever
think,
you are.
the women's stories and women's history just doesn't get portrayed on film at the way, to the level that certainly men's stories do. And that was another important reason that we wanted to do this film, because this is an action, it's a successful action, more or less, which has resulted in the creation of a number of institutions. Out of the Women's Center came the Rape Crisis Center, came the
Yeah.
Elizabeth Stone House, came Incest Survivors Group, came Transition House, and the Women's Community Cancer Project. So we could really list lesbian liberation, so many groups and institutions and organizations that really had their start from the Women's Center. And this story really, and the story of the women who were involved in that, and some men, needs to be made visible in the way that so many other stories have been made visible. And that's a big portion, big reason we wanted to do this.
Well, yeah, I think it's so important, because back then, we didn't have a movie to look at of what people had done in the 50s or the 40s or some other time. It was we had to think it all up.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it have been nice
Yeah.
to get some ideas from our past sisters and mothers?
Yeah, it's true. There's always this kind of struggle against the things becoming invisible, movements becoming invisible and forgotten. And
Yeah.
we have to constantly realize that things can change in an instant, as we saw with the recent election, and
Yeah.
they can get really ugly and really dark, and we need to remember there's a lot of things happening in the government right now with EPA information, the Environmental Protection Agency information being disappeared, and people struggling to try to capture it before
before
more of
this-
it gets disappeared,
Yeah.
and things are just not on the website that used to be about climate change, about basic scientific information. So, it's always a struggle to preserve history and communicate it to the next generation.
And we need models of resistance. I mean, that's the other thing,
Yeah.
particularly at this time. It's very important to know how people did resist in the past, and also how we did it with lots of humor. This film has a lot of humor in it,
It's very funny.
and how we were resilient as well. That it was based on that particular action, but the action really had reverberations in so many different areas.
And it had precedents too, or not precedents, but it had things that led up to it. It's one of those things that so often history that we're taught makes it seem as though something just sprang fully formed, Rosa Parks decided to sit down one day. She's always portrayed. They always talk about her as an elderly woman, but she was not elderly.
Yeah.
But anyway, without going into all that went before, that was totally planned. She was a committed activist, had been blah, blah, blah. Same thing here. I have seen that you have
Yes.
something here, and I'm wondering, is there a note to show it, perhaps?
That's an insert that was in the Old Mole at the time, calling for people.
The
for
Old
women.
Mole
The Old
was-
Mole paper, a local community newspaper with its office at one point just
Right on Brookline Street.
Brookline, yes, at Mass Ave.
Okay, so let's show this. And tell us about it.
Well, you can't really obviously read below the
Yeah.
International Women's Day, but it's telling people that there's going to be a rally and march on International Women's Day, Saturday, March 6, 1971, and that they list the places that the march was going to go by, including the Playboy Club.
Oh, yes.
And the Suffolk County Jail, which is now Liberty Hotel,
Is that
where
why it's called
women
Liberty Hotel?
incarcerated,
Yeah.
Yeah.
where women were incarcerated still. They continued to be incarcerated there until 1973. And then they were going to walk across the bridge between Boston and Cambridge to a surprise ending of a women's center. And in there it says they were going to go to the Commons. Of course, they had to say something,
Uh-huh.
but just to make it kind of general enough, which it was, so that the police who were following in their police cars could make the correct turns, except that they weren't prepared to make the turns that
The
people
famous
did
left on Pearl.
And
So
so
was
that
police
picture,
left waiting up at the Commons when the
Well,
on the march?
we don't know if
We
they
don't know,
were,
yeah.
but there were, they were trying to get around all the different one-way streets and figure out where people were going to. And the picture in the background is Russian.
It's actually, this is the centennial year of the Russian Revolution, and this is a picture of a demonstration in Petrograd during right after the overthrow of the Tsar, the abdication of the Tsar in February of 1917.
Wow.
So, but I want to also say before
Say it quick because we're shutting off and I want to show
The-
the thing.
program that the film has been accepted, Left on Pearl Street has been accepted for the Boston International Film Festival. There will be 2 screenings, one on Friday, April 14th, which is just about sold out, and another one on Monday, April 17th. So if you're running in the marathon, you can just run right into the theater. It's at the AMC Common, the second showing April 17th, 175 Tremont Street, and the first